Good morning, Alan Skinner here. Week 1 presentation, dissertation, research. When the United States declared war on Imperial Germany in April of 1917, the strength of the United States Army stood barely over 208,000 officers and men. In May of 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, authorizing the creation of a draftee army that would swell to almost 4 million men by the end of the war. Added to the existing regular Army and National Guard was a new component, the National Draftee Army. In 1918, Secretary of War Newton Baker officially abolished the distinction of components, asserting there was only one Army of the United States. Despite that bureaucratic change, the National Army divisions retained their unique citizen soldier culture while pragmatically learning the business of war. In the closing battles of the Great War, the National Army divisions helped to tip the balance of power to the Allied cause. Demobilized after the war, these wartime draftee divisions were reconstituted in 1920 as the Organized Reserve, known today as the Army Reserve. Despite the importance of the National Army to the American war effort, surprisingly little scholarship has been done in the field. I found only 16 dissertations, the oldest going back to 1932, and only 4 published since 2010. Typical of the dismissive attitude towards the National Army is Timothy Hinchel's 1988 dissertation discussing the Army during the Eisenhower era. Some 50 pages are devoted to surveying the reorganization of the Army from the Spanish-American War to the end of World War I, with only a single paragraph devoted to discussion of the National Army. The latest historiographical work I found is Dennis Showalter's 2002 essay, a good indicator of the general lack of American scholarly interest in the field, as borne out by the more recent historiographical work I found from European scholars, the latest from Alan Kramer, dated 2014. So, I plan to research and write on the National Army. Now, to scope my efforts, I plan to briefly survey the history of the National Army writ large before delving into a deep study of a single unit, the 81st Division. Besides a standard chronographical history of the organization, I also plan to explore the social history of its members, particularly the officers. The division commander and most senior leaders were regular officers temporarily promoted, while the junior leaders were products of wartime school. Lastly, I also want to explore the influence of progressivism on the creation of the National Army and its training and preparations for war. So the most recent dissertation in the field was James Hall's 2019 work. He first probed the effects of conscription on North Carolina draftees during the World War. After discussing military service in previous wars and the influences of those experiences in popular memory, Hall focuses on the mechanics of the draft as it played out in North Carolina. He draws heavily on the letters and memoirs of the involved soldiers and citizens. And he concludes that most men willingly, if not enthusiastically, supported the draft, and a positive theme of that service was carried into post-war popular memory. Hall's research will be very useful on my social history of men in the 81st Division, many of whom were drafted from North Carolina. Unlike later wars, inductions were handled regionally instead of across the entire United States. So, for example, the 81st Division received men from the Carolinas and Florida, while the first draft in the 82nd Division were from Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. The second cited dissertation is Matthew Margus's 2016 work, which studied the influence of progressive reforms on the National Guard in the earliest 20th century. Margus argues that progressive efforts to reform government and society were also influential in reforms within the military. His secondary research question analyzed American society through the viewpoint of National Guard officers and men. While the bulk of his research is drawn from the National Archives and state archives, he does do a good job of supplementing the work with newspaper articles and a handful of paper collections. Margus's work is useful for illuminating how progressivism influenced the reformation of the National Guard, information that's useful for tracing the parallel influence of progressive reforms on the National Army. Moreover, his research revealed some previously untapped National Archive record groups that will help in my own research. Thank you for your time. This concludes my presentation.